Imagine for a second that you're standing in the back of a typical high school classroom.
Okay.
You're looking at a straight A student,
Yeah.
right? Someone who has, always been incredibly reliable. And suddenly they drop a full letter grade.
Just out of nowhere.
Right, out of nowhere. There's absolutely zero obvious cause, like no major life event, no sudden trauma that anyone's aware of, just a sudden drop.
Yeah.
And then you look over at another kid, someone who used to be like sharp as a tack during first period, and they're staring blankly at the board, total morning fog. Meanwhile, down the hall, the school nurse's office is packed. Just full of students complaining of mysterious stomach aches and, recurrent headaches.
Which is such a specific visual.
It is. So you have to ask yourself, is a sudden, inexplicable mental health epidemic sweeping through this school, or is there something else entirely, like something massive just hiding in plain sight?
Well, when you look at that exact classroom scenario, the immediate human instinct is to assume something is fundamentally broken with these students' mental health.
Yes.
Like, we see distress and we just immediately assume pathology. But what's fascinating here is that the initial presentation of a problem rarely tells you its true origin story.
Which brings us directly to the source material for today's deep dive. We are looking at some really revealing excerpts from a document titled The Digital Sleep Deficit and Adolescent Diagnostic Misalignment.
It's quite a title.
Right. And it also pulls in clinical data from a specialized K-12 mental health support program down in Georgia called MentalSpace School.
Yes, which has some incredible insights.
Totally. So our mission today is to uncover how the modern teenage sleep crisis is actively masquerading as complex mental health disorders.
Right.
We're going to explore how this phenomenon just completely baffles educators, traps well-meaning doctors in these, diagnostic dead ends, and how certain systemic models are finally trying to untangle the mess. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We have to start with what the teachers are seeing on the ground, before any medical professional even enters the chat.
Because that classroom reality, that's the front line.
Yeah.
Teachers are witnessing a barrage of symptoms that, at first glance, they seem completely disconnected.
Right.
You mentioned the academic drop and the morning fog, but the source material also highlights severe behavioral spikes.
Oh, like the outbursts?
Exactly. We're talking about sudden irritability and emotional volatility over just minor inconveniences. There are students literally falling asleep mid-conversation or right in the middle of a test.
Wow.
And then there are those somatic complaints,
Yeah.
the physical manifestations of whatever is going on.
Yeah, the text specifically notes a massive surge in nurse visits for recurrent headaches and stomach aches that have absolutely no clear medical cause.
Right. No fever, no virus.
Right. If a kid has a stomach virus, that's one thing. But these are daily, unexplainable pains. And the timing is what really grabbed my attention.
Timing is crucial.
It really is. The mid-morning behavioral incidents and these nurse visits are heavily concentrated in the first and second periods of the school day. And furthermore, this tracks almost frighteningly well with spikes in inattention referrals, overlapping directly with major growth periods in adolescent social media usage.
Yeah, the timing is basically the Rosetta Stone here. Teachers spend hundreds of hours with these adolescents, right? They are incredible pattern matchers, even if they aren't diagnosing kids clinically.
They see the shifts.
They do. So when a teacher sees the stomach aches and connects them to the irritability and the blank stares in first period, they're witnessing a systemic whole-body alarm.
It's like putting a piece of tape over a car's check engine light.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Like, you don't see the light anymore, but the engine is still, failing. How are teachers supposed to make sense of this barrage of disconnected symptoms? And also, how does a lack of sleep cause a literal stomachache?
Right, that's the big question.
Because I think a lot of people assume being tired just makes you yawn. They don't associate it with physical pain.
Well, it comes down to how the body processes extreme exhaustion. When a teenager is severely sleep-deprived, their autonomic nervous system gets thrown completely out of balance.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the body perceives that profound lack of recovery as a physical threat, which triggers a low-grade fight-or-flight response.
So they're in survival mode.
Exactly. Cortisol levels spike. And that stress response directly impacts the vagus nerve, which runs from the brain straight to the gut.
Wow, so they are physically connected.
Highly connected.
Sure.
So the stomach aches isn't a kid faking it to get out of math class. It's a genuine somatic manifestation of physiological stress. The body and the brain are simultaneously shutting down and sounding the alarm.
That reframes the entire picture. It's not a dozen different quirky behaviors. It's like a unified presentation of a singular crisis.
Precisely.
But treating those individual classroom outbursts or, handing out ibuprofen for the stomach ache without looking at the origin, that just feels futile.
It's completely reactive.
Yeah. So if an educator spots these morning symptoms, the logical next step is to rewind the tape to the night before.
Yes, looking upstream.
Right. And our source text outlines this underlying engine driving the crisis. It's an intensely depressing loop they call the 4-5-7 cycle.
The sheer math of this cycle is brutal.
Yeah.
And it perfectly explains the biology we were just talking about.
Yeah, the text breaks it down like this. You have roughly 4 hours of nighttime scrolling. That leads directly into 5 hours of fragmented sleep, which then results in 7 hours of trying to function while severely sleep deprived.
The grueling schedule.
And the kicker is that they do it all again the next night. Like 4 hours scrolling, 5 hours sleeping, 7 hours masking, every single day.
Let's focus on the term fragmented sleep for a second, because that's where the real damage happens.
Okay, yeah.
It doesn't just say 5 hours of sleep. When an adolescent is scrolling for 4 hours, they are literally bathing their retinas in blue light, which suppresses melatonin production.
Right, the sleep hormone.
Exactly. But more importantly, they are engaging with highly stimulating, fast-paced digital content right up until the literal second they close their eyes.
Oh, right, like TikTok or Instagram Reels?
Yeah. Or worse, their phone is buzzing on the nightstand, waking them up constantly to check notifications.
Right. It makes me think of the brain during deep sleep like a computer running a defragmentation cycle.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, like it needs that uninterrupted time to take all the chaotic files of the day, organize them, file away memories, and basically clear the RAM for the next morning.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Because of the 4-5-7 cycle, the adolescent brain never actually gets to complete that defrag process.
So they wake up cluttered.
Exactly. The architecture of their sleep is completely broken. They're missing the continuous REM and deep wave cycles necessary for baseline cognitive repair. They are starting the school day with 99% of their cognitive RAM already maxed out.
Man. Which makes that 7 hours of trying to function part of the cycle sound like absolute torture.
It is.
Just thinking about trying to mask profound exhaustion for 7 straight hours in a loud, chaotic high school cafeteria sounds like a nightmare.
It's sensory overload on top of exhaustion.
Honestly, I barely have the executive function to make it through a 1-hour Zoom meeting when I haven't slept well.
Right.
The fact that a teenager is expected to navigate complex social dynamics, absorb pre-calculus, and regulate their emotions while their brain's RAM is totally full is wild to me.
It requires a monumental cognitive load. They are actively burning through whatever tiny residual reserves of executive function they have left just to sit upright in a chair.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though, because I struggle with this premise a little bit.
Okay, lay it on me.
Because I understand they're tired, right, and I understand they're burning through their reserves. But at some point, these kids are being sent to licensed doctors and psychiatrists.
Yes, they are.
You're telling me a highly trained clinician genuinely cannot tell the difference between a kid who stayed up way too late on TikTok and a kid with a legitimate neurodevelopmental disorder like ADHD.
It's a completely valid skepticism.
Shouldn't there be obvious clinical markers that separate a tired kid from a sick one?
Yeah, and that strikes at the very heart of what the source calls the diagnostic trap. To understand why a clinician can't easily tell them apart, we have to look at the biological mechanism of what the text calls sleep-mediated cognitive impairment.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of that. Why does exhaustion mimic pathology so perfectly?
Well, when a teenager only gets 5 hours of fragmented sleep over a sustained period, their prefrontal cortex, which is the area of the brain responsible for impulse control, focus, and emotional regulation,
Right.
it's essentially starved of glucose.
Right.
It physically does not have the metabolic energy to do its job.
Oh, wow.
Now, in a patient with true ADHD, that same prefrontal cortex struggles to function properly, but usually because of structural dopamine deficiencies or differences in how neurotransmitters are processed.
So you're saying the output looks exactly the same, even though the input is totally different.
Precisely. To a doctor sitting in an office, observing a teenager for maybe 45 minutes, a sleep-deprived brain acting out from an energy deficit looks clinically identical to a brain struggling with the dopamine deficiencies of ADHD.
That is wild.
The student can't focus, they're irritable, Their executive function is shattered. The downstream symptoms are indistinguishable.
That is terrifying. If the downstream symptoms are indistinguishable, the doctor's basically flying blind if they don't dig into the kid's nighttime habits.
And that's the core of the misalignment. In medicine, if you only treat the downstream symptoms, what you see in the water miles away from the source,
Right.
you never fix the polluted river upstream.
Right.
In this scenario, the upstream issue is the chronic, digitally driven sleep deficit. The downstream symptoms are the failing grades, the attitude, the depression-like withdrawal.
So the trap springs when the clinician doesn't conduct a coordinated, holistic assessment.
Exactly.
They see a kid who can't pay attention and acts out. They diagnose ADHD. They route that student into accommodations at school, and maybe they prescribe stimulant medication.
Which is the ultimate irony. Prescribing a stimulant to a kid whose primary issue is an inability to sleep.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And the entire time, that upstream failure, the 4 hours of scrolling and the fragmented sleep, it continues completely ignored.
Completely.
The student carries a misdiagnosis for years, receiving treatments that will never actually resolve the issue.
Now, the source material is very careful to add a critical layer of nuance here, which we definitely need to acknowledge.
Right, of course.
This data does not suggest that adolescent ADHD, anxiety, and clinical depression aren't real. It's not claiming that every single diagnosis is just a sleepy teenager.
Right. It explicitly states that these conditions are very real and often co-present with sleep issues. But the key takeaway from the text is that sleep is almost always part of the picture now.
Yes, always a factor.
Treating a mood or attention disorder without simultaneously addressing the massive sleep deficit just doesn't move the needle. You can't accommodate away exhaustion, and you certainly can't medicate it away.
If you apply a perfectly valid ADHD intervention to a foundation of severe sleep deprivation, the intervention fails. The baseline functioning won't improve because the brain is still starving for that defragmentation cycle.
This brings us to a pivotal shift in how we handle this. So what does this all mean for the parents and teachers trying to help?
It requires a paradigm shift.
Yeah. The source argues that the most useful conversations happening right now between parents, teachers, and clinicians start by treating sleep as a clinical variable rather than just a parenting variable.
Exactly.
If you're a parent listening to this, this is the moment where the traditional advice of just take the phone away starts to look dangerously inadequate.
Historically, society views a teenager staying up late on their phone as a discipline issue. The household rule is broken, so you enforce a consequence. You take the device.
Right, ground them.
But the physiological reality of sleep-mediated cognitive impairment means we are way past simple discipline. Parenting harder isn't a medical intervention for a brain mimicking clinical depression.
No, definitely not.
Elevating sleep to a clinical variable means a doctor must assess a teenager's sleep hygiene with the exact same rigor they would use to assess a chemical imbalance or a family history of trauma.
But practically speaking, how do you actually execute that? It's easy for us to sit here on mics and say doctors need to ask about sleep.
Sure.
It's another thing entirely for an overwhelmed public school system and a deeply fragmented healthcare system to coordinate an effort to fix it.
Yeah.
How do stalls and doctors disentangle the knot on the ground?
This is where the concept of sequenced intervention becomes vital. The text outlines a clear division of labor.
Okay.
The school staff, the teachers, the nurses, they are the alarm bells. They identify the pattern of the 4-5-7 cycle manifesting in the classroom.
Right, they see the symptoms first.
But they cannot diagnose.
Right.
Only a clinical professional has the training to figure out if the student is dealing with primary anxiety, primary ADHD, or primary sleep deficit, or some tangled combination of them all.
And sequence intervention means you don't try to fix everything at once.
Right. You methodically address the variables. You aggressively fix the sleep hygiene first. You reestablish the deep sleep cycles.
Okay.
Then you wait and see what symptoms remain after the sleep deficit is resolved. If the anxiety or the attention issues persist once the brain is fully rested, that is your true underlying clinical disorder.
That makes logical sense, but the friction in our healthcare system usually makes that kind of methodical pacing impossible.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if a teacher notices a student struggling in October, it might take 3 months for the parents to get an appointment with a specialist.
Easily.
By January, the kid has failed the semester, the 4-5-7 cycle is deeply entrenched, and the clinician sees a kid in full-blown crisis mode.
Which is exactly why the source text highlights the MentalSpace school model in Georgia. If we connect this to the bigger picture, they are attempting to collapse that timeline entirely.
Let's look at how they are actually doing that, because
Yeah.
the document spends a lot of time on their specific infrastructure.
Yeah.
They are a K-12 mental health support system acting as a bridge between the schools and the clinical layer. But instead of just giving us a brochure of acronyms, the text points out that their entire strategy revolves around removing bureaucratic friction.
The insight here is all about access. The model provides dedicated, diverse, culturally competent licensed therapist teams directly to partner schools, offering same-day teletherapy assessment.
Same day.
Same day.
So a teacher's concern in the morning turns into a clinical assessment by the afternoon rather than 3 months later.
Exactly. They're removing the delay that allows symptoms to fester and diagnostic waters to get muddy. And crucially, they are stripping away the financial friction.
Yeah, that's huge. The report notes they integrate with school counselors and they take almost every major insurance. BCBS, Cigna, Aetna, UHC, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, AmeriGroup.
It's a massive network.
And they make the care totally free for Medicaid patients, $0. They're also fully HIPAA and FERPA compliant, offering HB 268 compliant support ahead of the July 2026 deadline in Georgia.
Which is vital for schools trying to navigate all these new mandates.
Right. The takeaway isn't just about healthcare billing, it's about building an infrastructure that catches the kid before they fall into the diagnostic trap. If the parents don't have to fight with insurance for months, the sequenced intervention can actually happen.
And according to the data provided in the report, this model shows significant promise.
The numbers cited are definitely eye-catching. The text reports an 89% improvement in attendance and a 92% reduction in anxiety among the students utilizing this model, alongside an 85% family satisfaction rate.
If we look at that 92% reduction in anxiety objectively, it tells us something profound about the nature of the crisis.
Yeah.
If these students were dealing with intractable, purely structural anxiety disorders, simply removing the access barriers wouldn't yield a 92% drop.
That's a great point.
That kind of success rate suggests that by using sequenced intervention, by likely identifying that the anxiety was secondary to a massive sleep deficit and treating the root cause, they are genuinely resolving the issue. It strongly supports the thesis that proper coordinated diagnosis works when the friction is removed.
It's a fascinating look at how a seemingly unsolvable crisis might just be a massive logistical puzzle.
It really is.
Okay, let's take a step back and recap the journey we've been on today. We started with the mystery of the classroom, the previously sharp first-period student who is suddenly staring blankly at the board, and the nurse's office full of unexplainable stress-induced stomach aches.
Yeah.
We trace those symptoms back to the grueling 4-5-7 scrolling loop.
We explored the biological mechanics of that loop, how a lack of deep sleep defragmentation starves the prefrontal cortex of glucose, creating a cognitive impairment that perfectly mimics ADHD and clinical depression. This creates a diagnostic trap where well-meaning doctors treat the downstream behavioral symptoms while the upstream sleep deficit goes completely ignored.
And finally, we looked at how systemic models, like the one being deployed in Georgia by MentalSpace School, are trying to untangle the mess by collapsing the timeline and removing the friction, allowing for true sequenced intervention.
Exactly.
So why does all of this matter to you? Well, whether you're a parent navigating these exact waters with a teenager, an educator trying to manage a chaotic classroom, or just someone interested in how our brains respond to the modern world, understanding the fundamental difference between a downstream symptom and an upstream cause completely changes how we view human behavior.
It really does.
It forces us to look past the surface and ask what the engine is really trying to tell us.
Which leaves us with one final, slightly uncomfortable question to consider.
Oh boy.
We've spent this entire deep dive analyzing adolescence. We've looked at how 4 hours of scrolling and fragmented sleep fundamentally alters their neurochemistry and mimics clinical depression. But considering the device that is likely sitting in your own pocket right now, or the screen you were staring at last night, how often are we as adults misdiagnosing our own burnout, our own anxiety, or our own inability to focus at work, when the real culprit is just the glowing screen we refuse to put down at midnight?